Hello, everybody, and welcome to the start of an exciting term, Management 515. This is Management that Transforms, and I am your instructor for this term, and I look forward to having you and participating with you throughout. Now, the first week is we're going to focus on leadership in management that transforms. And then the second week, we're going to focus on management because I think it's important to understand the two very different hats that any single individual will wear and trade off at various times. So you've got to understand the difference between the two of them. Before I even jump into leadership, however, I want us to all understand how we got here along the way. So there were a couple of theories that we want to look at that will help us understand the modern world of leadership and management. The first is the scientific management that was emphasized by Frederick Taylor. And so with scientific management, right, people can trace this idea to the 1700s, right? That they were working in factories. But by the 20th century, right, or the 1900s, we needed to have a better understanding how to create productivity during this industrial revolution. So, one of the earliest theorists was Frederick Taylor, and he started this scientific management movement. And what he and his associates did was study for the first time the work processes scientifically. Now, that's going to be very important next week when we talk about management, work processes. So, this is, even though we've moved on from scientific management, this is not a waste of time. It's an integrated approach that we're building. So, what he did was he studied how work was done or performed, and then he looked at the workers themselves and were they productive. And Taylor would say that as he looked at it, that his belief that making people work hard as they could was not as efficient as optimizing the way work was done. This is about processes. So Taylor published what he called the Principles of Scientific Management, and he proposed that that by optimizing and simplifying jobs, productivity would increase. He also advanced the idea that workers and managers need to cooperate with each other. See, this was different than what was the current day's practice before his scientific management theory. Back then, before this theory, a factory manager at the time really had very little contact with the workers. He left them on their own to produce the necessary product. There was no standardization, and a worker's really main motivation was often continued employment, so they weren't destitute. So there was no incentive to work as quickly or effectively as possible. So we get a lot of good things out of scientific management. We get process improvement, we get streamlining, we get simplification of jobs, all good things. Taylor believed that all workers were motivated by money. So he promoted the idea of a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, right? In other words, if a worker didn't achieve enough in a day, he didn't deserve to be paid as much as another worker who was highly productive. And I think this is where Taylor's theory goes a little awry. And you'll notice in the additional links this week, I have Edward Deming's red bead experiment. In that, if you'll watch that link, Edward Deming describes, and so does the narrator, how management can actually get in the way of workers achieving what they need. But let's not lose sight of the good things that came out of the scientific management approach. Again, process improvement, standardization, streamlining, and efficiencies as far as simplifying the worker's role, which can help you produce faster things. Then we turn to the Hawthorne effect. So trade unions were not a big fan of the scientific method principles. They would promote more participatory decision making and decentralization. And then, so they wanted to understand if that was a gap to the scientific method. Again, Taylor was going to focus on people who are motivated by just money. So for about a 30-year period, Mary Follet and others, they took this concept of Taylor's scientific management, which was dominating the workforce, as an approach to maximizing worker output. And Taylor instead emphasized that output and efficiency didn't address the employee's needs. And that would lead some of these trade unions at the time to resist implementation of the scientific principles, which had some very positive effects. So this Follet was opposed to Taylor's lack of specific attention to human needs and relationships in the workplace. And so she was one of the first management theorists to promote participatory decision-making and decentralization. We would use terms today like empowerment, for example. And so the human element became her focus, her view on how to manage. Remember, the scientific method and the method prior to that really weren't engaged in that effect. So they did the Hawthorne studies. Though flawed, Follett was trying to prove to many managers and academics like ourselves to focus on employees' needs and attitudes. That was Hawthorne's study one. Then they did a second one. Because in the Hawthorne study one, they said, well, what we need is empirical evidence that is going to focus on people producing a higher productivity in that kind of environment. So Harvard took it up. Harvard researchers learned that economic rewards did not explain totally worker behavior, right? Again, I mentioned that was one of the mistakes of the scientific method. So workers were observant. They complied with norms and respected the information and the social structure of their group, information passed. And so what researchers learned was that social pressures restrict output, right? And so there are a lot of interviews done and over years in these Hawthorne studies and by any number of varied and diverse participants. And the data has been analyzed and reanalyzed. And the conclusions are supportive that managers can help boost productivity and that instead of having people fear the jobs that they may lose. So the conclusion really becomes that in the Hawthorne studies that supportive managers help boost productivity, right? And so the fear of losing your job during the Great Depression, for example, and managerial discipline became a negative output to productivity. These are not the practices of supportive managers. Sometimes we'd call them a Theory X manager today if you're interested in further studies, Theory X and Theory Y, right? And so the Hawthorne studies are still considered a major impetus behind the emphasis on understanding and dealing with human resources as it relates to productivity. And so with that background, we get into leading teams, right? We're going to talk about leadership this week and management next week, okay? And we're going to try and cover some of these objectives throughout the entire course as it relates to management that transforms. And if you're going to compete in the modern business world, make no mistake, you must be management that transforms along the way. So first we begin to talk about leadership and management along the way. Effective leadership is going to be centered on vision to guide change. Whereas managers, I'm already making the distinction that will solidify next week, managers set out to achieve the organizational goals through implementing those processes like the scientific method would emphasize, such as budgeting and organizational structuring and staffing. But leaders are more intent on thinking ahead and capitalizing on opportunities. I kind of see it as a fishing analogy. While the people are at the shore collecting up the fish and organizing them, cleaning them, leaders are taking the fishing pole, throwing the line way out and skimming it left and right as they reel it in to try and figure out where the next big catch is going to be located at. So, to make the point, leadership versus management, both are necessary. And as individuals, you wear both hats all the time, sometimes at the same time, quite often taking one off, putting the other on. So, even though these two terms, leadership and management, are used synonymously, they're really very different. And you could, if you wanted an additional resource, Cotter in 2013 published a work in that regard. You could Google that. But leadership is too often used only to describe the people at the very top of an organization, right? And management might be described at the next layers. And I'd say, no. You are at every level leadership and management at the same time with various roles and responsibilities and spans of control. So management on the right would be a set of then well-known processes, right? Like, as I mentioned, planning, budgeting, structuring jobs, defining roles, staffing, measuring performance, problem solving. All these things help the organization to predictably do what it knows how to do well. So management is crucial, but it is not leadership. Leadership is different. It's about the future and the vision. It's about people buying in. It's about empowerment, as we get from the Hawthorne effect. And most of all, it's about producing useful change, right? I will offer also that organizations that flatten leadership are becoming increasingly more important, regardless of the hierarchy of the organization, right? Flat organizations. So, do you think that a few people can provide all the necessary leadership that an organization needs, right? I think this is a key point, right? Management and leadership at every level each serve different and critical functions. We need both leadership and management, and we need them at every single level. If we continue to mistake leadership for management, or if we continue to mistake that we're only management, not leadership, we're going to continue to work harder at building management to the exclusion of leadership, right? And this is going to leave us increasingly vulnerable in this fast changing world that we live in. Hence this course, Management That Transforms. So I'm going to pause here in a moment, come back with part 2 of this week's slideshow. And I want you to consider how many differences there are between leadership and management. Just contemplate that. We're going to pause now and come back with the remaining conversation for this week.